Here we go, the phosphorus cycle. And what's unique about the phosphorus cycle is that there is no gas state within the phosphorus cycle. One thing to remember here, it just stays within the rocks and or living systems, making it a local cycle. Right? Since in the atmosphere it can transfer through vast distances. So here we're looking at an ecosystem, and now phosphorus can cycle through this ecosystem, and it shows per metric tons of phosphorus. Remember though that phosphorus does not have a gas stage. That's why it stays in local areas. So here you can have like human induce, where you have industrial waste of phosphorus, and then it runs off into local lower lying areas into the water, where it can then be a nutrient source for phytoplankton, zooplankton, and then transfer through the food chain through consumption. And then as those organisms die, decompose, that phosphorus then can be returned into the sediment. And then you can see it here as it cycles through sediments, and then weathering process can cause it to be transferred through streams back into. So you can see how it cycles through a ecosystem. So why do living things need phosphorus? Well, ATP, which is the main source of energy for all living things, and ATP stands for adenine triphosphate, so there are 3 phosphates on this group. DNA, which has a phosphate backbone. Bones themselves, calcium phosphates. So what are the major differences between nitrogen and phosphate cycles? That's right. So phosphorus, there's no gaseous stage, and phosphorus is tied up in some form of rocks, which differs it from nitrogen. It's also not very soluble, meaning dissolves in water, so it doesn't leach readily, or doesn't escape readily. For these reasons, phosphorus tend to be limiting nutrients in many ecosystems. Remember that from Chapter 5, limiting nutrients, and being a limiting factor can cause populations to increase and or, if they're not readily available, decrease. Some human-induced changes can have accelerated long-term loss of land. Agriculture, where we grow plants. And think about this. So as you grow your crops, you want to add phosphorus. And the phosphorus will cause the plants to grow nice and big. And the phosphorus then is transferred into the plant. Well, when the human comes and cuts down my tree and ships it to China, where's the phosphorus go? Yeah, the phosphorus goes along with it. So through agriculture, phosphorus that usually should stay in a local system can be transferred and reduced from different ecosystems. Also, human waste and fertilizers can cause phosphorus levels to change in an area. And humans will mine rocks containing phosphorus to produce fertilizers, and similar problems with nitrates, especially as phosphorus is often the limiting to begin with. So even though that we're mining it, we're also mining the limited amount that is there for that ecosystem and transferring it to other places. So here we have the sulfur cycle, and the sulfur cycle, we're not going to go too in-depth with the sulfur cycle, but sulfur can transfer through an ecosystem similar ways that nitrogen and phosphorus do, but sulfur does have a gaseous stage, and usually sulfur is released into the atmosphere either through volcanoes and or combustion of fossil fuels. Sulfur is also included in fertilizers. So here as we finish up our biogeochemical cycles, just a review. Some of the cycles are quick, move quick through their cycles, like oxygen and nitrogen. Others are easily tied up in relatively immobile forms and are returned to availability slowly, like phosphorus. General rule, if cycle includes a gas stage in the atmosphere, the chemical cycles rapidly. Others, especially insoluble in water, end up buried beneath the sediment. like phosphorus, and those cycles can take a long period of time. And human impacts on these cycles illustrate how human activities interfere with these biogeochemical cycles. Like nitrogen fixation produces much more fixed nitrogen in nature, and when we fix it from a gas to a usable form by living things, nitrogen is much more readily available, therefore causing more eutrophication. Remember, eutrophication is that explosion in populations causing a decrease in the biotic factor of a lake. At the same time, habitat loss reduces denitrifying bacteria, less nitrates converted back into the atmosphere. So as we decrease our habitat, we also decrease the bacteria that transfer nitrogen back into the atmosphere, causing more nitrogen in forms that life can use, also increasing nitrification. And nitrates also are toxic at high concentrations. Now we're going to be looking at the hydrologic cycle. Remember, the hydrologic cycle talks about water. So here we have different stages within our hydrologic cycle, like evaporation, where you get water turning from a liquid to a gas. Condensation, which water in the atmosphere condenses. Precipitation can be rain, snow, sleet, or hail, where water in the atmosphere then falls back to the land. Transpiration, which is like plants sweating, so plants allowing evaporation of water within their cells to leach out into the atmosphere. Infiltration, where water then that hits the ground through precipitation or in lakes infiltrates through the soil into groundwater or lower lying areas. And then runoff, where water goes from a higher elevation to a lower elevation. So our main concern with human-induced changes to the water cycle is obtaining and guaranteeing an adequate clean water supply for drinking, hydroelectricity, where we use water to generate electricity through dams, agriculture, watering our crops, and other industrial uses. Well, another concern with the water cycle has to do with aerosols. And let me see, I'm going to write it here, aerosols. And what aerosols are different molecules in the atmosphere from pollution. Right? And these can be just from nitrates, carbon, mineral dust, or fly ash, and they can get in the atmosphere through any act that causes these molecules to move upward, like burning of trees or transportation and the byproducts of combustion. So these aerosols are in the air. Or dust is another aerosol. They're in the air, and you might not even be able to see them. But what happens around these aerosols is you get condensation. The reason why water condenses is because it needs to condense around something. And it condenses around these aerosols. And when we get water molecules that condense around aerosols in a grouping, what do we call that? Yeah, we call that a cloud. And if we have different aerosols and different quantities around the Earth, we get different cloud formations that aren't normal. And if you change the normal pattern of clouds, then you can change the hydrologic cycles in local areas.